now that you have watched that short clip, kind of giving some background to or explaining what it is that Evans Pritchard did in Zonderland, I'd sort of like to explain the article to you in this the second part of this very brief lecture. Those of you who took Ant 203 with me will remember this reading. Those that haven't will now learn that this piece is perhaps one of the most famous pieces of writing in cultural anthropology of all time. It's a very important piece. Evans Pritchard is arguably one of the most important British social anthropologists of all time, and certainly one of the most important anthropologists of the 20th century. So this is really a classic piece in, again, social and cultural anthropology, which for those of you who are interested, the difference between cultural anthropology is a sort of American school versus social anthropology is the way that it's typically outlined or described in Britain. And that's because British anthropologists like Evans Pritchard were primarily interested in social structure, politics, the structure of society. That was the topic that most of their ethnographies in that tradition of British social anthropology focused on, the social. So here we have an image of Southern Sudan, Zonderland. That's where Evans Pritchard was working. And this obviously is an image of a granary, of one of the granaries that you would have seen, certainly at that time, but also still in some areas of Zonderland. Now, turns out that it's very hot in southern Sudan, and folks spend a lot of time sitting under the granaries in order to seek shade. But sometimes granaries fall, as you learned from this piece and in that documentary clip. And sometimes when they fall while someone happens to be under them. Now, to be clear, the Azande understand that termites eat wooden posts, and that because of that, this may lead to the destruction of the posts, the destruction of the granaries. But the question that they pose through the question of witchcraft is why, right? What lies behind the termites as the real origin of that problem, of the problem of the granary falling down. Again, here we have another image of someone seeking shade underneath one of the granaries. Evans Pritchard writes, the Zonde belief in no way contradicts the empirical knowledge of cause and effect. The world known to the senses is just as real to them as it is to us. Okay, so he's being very clear. The Zonde are just as perceptive as all of us, right? As humans, we all share, those of us who are able-bodied, right, share the same capacity to enact our senses. And so therefore they understand this basic cause and effect correlation or relationship between termites and granary destruction. But what Evans Pritchard argues is that what we might call rationality, this cause and effect, the termite question, can be, we can quote unquote believe, again, a term I don't like us to use, so we can be committed, right, to that understanding at the same time that we can be committed to the understanding that witchcraft exists. Right? So in other words, this explanation of witchcraft and this explanation of termites can actually exist at the same time. Again, witchcraft and understanding cause and effect can exist alongside one another. An example of this in our culture, you can think of folks who believe in science and scientific method, right? Who are loyal or committed to that idea, who might at the same time be Muslim, who might at the same time be Jewish, right? So this happens in our society all the time, right? That folks have these sorts of beliefs. But it's interesting that when we look at other cultures, the jump or the leap is always not the leap, the assumption rather is that they're not somehow not rational, right? So that's Evans Pritchard's main argument, or one of the main arguments of this piece, right? Is that witchcraft can exist alongside rationality. Witchcraft is not necessarily irrational. In fact, it is extremely rational when you put yourself in the shoes of the Azande, as I'll explain right now. So, this idea of witchcraft explaining unfortunate events for Evans Pritchard comes up in the terms of second spear. Okay, this is why sociocultural anthropology is so closely related to or invested in principles from linguistic anthropology. When we do research as cultural anthropologists, we're listening very specifically to the terms, the words that community members use to describe something. We might find certain kinds of metaphors that emerge from that discourse that give us an insight into how people are thinking. And we see this here, an example of the second spear. So among the Zande, when men, and as he describes, typically it's men go to hunt in this particular society, they go out to hunt game with spears. You'll have two men who go out to hunt, and it's the second spear that is used to kill the wild animal, right? So the first guy goes, he takes the spear, hits the animal, but his buddy, who also has a spear, will take his spear, so it's the second spear, and go up to the animal and make sure that the animal is killed, right, with that second spear. So the first spear, right, the first one to hit the animal, is kind of the obvious termite-like explanation, right? It's the obvious explanation. Obviously, the granary fell because of termites. We can see where the termites eat the posts, right? But it's the second spear that's like the witchcraft explanation. It exists behind the termite explanation rather. And this emerged through fieldwork for Evans Pritchard because the term used for witchcraft is the same as that used for the second spear, mbaga, right? So it's saying, why is that word for second spear the same as the word for witchcraft? Right? Again, it's because the second spear is like the reasoning behind the first spear. It's the less evident reasoning for witchcraft. You think of it as the underlying issue. Now, Evans Pritchard is also very clear that the Zande don't explain or reduce all events to witchcraft. Can you think of an example in the text that Evans Pritchard said couldn't be reduced to witchcraft? I'll give you a hint. It's on page 26. Go ahead and read the first full paragraph on page 26. You can pause this video if you'd like. So on page 26, an interlocutor, someone that Evans Pritchard is talking to, claims that he lied to Evans Pritchard because he was bewitched. Oh, I lied because I was bewitched, right? And all the other villagers, the other interlocutors standing around, laughed and they said, oh, that's not how this works, right? So again, there's a rationality behind witchcraft. There's rules for what would make sense for someone to be bewitched or not in that particular cultural context. So it's not like you can just blame everything on witchcraft. It's not like there's no rules or no norms. There's a very clear set of norms and rules and guidelines in the society about what constitutes witchcraft. So E.P. Evans Pritchard proves that the Azande worldview was, quote, internally consistent and reasonable. Okay. If we are to apply cultural relativism, if we're to put ourselves in the cultural context of the Azande, this actually makes sense, right? this actually makes sense because yes, they can understand that the termites are what, initially caused the granary to fall, but it cannot explain why did the granary fall at that exact moment when that exact particular person was sitting under the granary. So again, witchcraft explained unexpected events, right? Things that seem to happen out of nowhere, things like granaries falling on victims unto their deaths, right? So obviously, granaries aren't the only thing that is that event which is often chalked up to witchcraft, right? There are many other things, but this is the one that Evans Pritchard focuses on in this particular piece. So again, the Izande understand how. They understand that termites cause this, right? But they can't explain the underlying why questions. He writes, quote, "To our mind, the only relationship between these two independently caused facts, the time, moment, and the person being under the granary, right? This connection between, oh, that happened then while that person was there. We think of this in terms of coincidence, right? We have no explanation of why the two chains of causation intersected at a certain time in a certain place. Witchcraft, however, explains the coincidence of these two happenings," end quote. So again, we would explain this as, oh, that's just bad luck, right? Bad luck, that's just coincidence. But the Azande will explain this in terms of bad will, meaning that someone had ill intent upon someone else, upon that person who was sitting perhaps underneath that granary. Right? Someone wanted to hurt another person, right? Using invisible force, right? Again, witchcraft. So this is important, right? That we understand this in terms of bad luck. They understand this in terms of bad will. Again, someone could say, oh, well, it was just the termites that caused this. So obviously, that caused challenge the structural integrity of the granary. That's just bad luck. But how do you explain bad luck, right? That there's no real, you haven't asked the deeper why question with that kind of response. So again, this is an important example of why in cultural anthropology, particularly studies of religion, it's not really an issue of whether or not these folks, quote unquote, believe in witchcraft. It's not about belief, because anthropologically speaking, we're really more interested in the effects of this socially constituted ritual act, right? We're more interested in the effects of witchcraft accusations and how they might address some of these deeper why questions for that particular community, for that particular society, at that particular moment. So for us, witchcraft is something that Durkheim would call a social fact, by which he means it's a shared social reality. Everyone is on board with the idea that this is potentially or could be witchcraft, and therefore it matters to us as anthropologists, right? We don't need to adjudicate, we don't need to decide whether or not witchcraft is real or whether it's false. It doesn't matter as long as interlocutors, as long as it matters to interlocutors, it matters to us. So I'm going to try to go through the next just couple slides very briefly. So I have 3 different questions that I put into 3 groups. I would like for us to discuss these in person. And so I'm going to give you these quotes. The second 2 actually are also questions themselves. But I'm going to provide these, leave them up here for you to read all of them. please record these somewhere, right? Or just return to this video. I'd like you to briefly answer all three of these on your own, okay? And before next class, or when you arrive in the classroom for next class, please have brief responses for all of these, and I'll put you into groups to discuss them, okay? Very brief, I'm just thinking a couple sentences each, okay? So, and I won't assign your groups until we're in class, so please do all three of these for homework. Group 1, given the history of Western prejudice and racism, however, students of Africa must be circumspect, careful and respectful when conducting research and discussing these issues. Okay, so I'm going to encourage you to go back to the text that is Ashforth on page 366. What does he mean by this? What is he talking about? Unpack this in just a couple sentences. Okay, number 2, while laudable in their desire to protect people from hardship and violence, interventions to protect accused witches in the name of human rights share the colonial era attitude of foreigners. Page 376. Again, in a couple sentences, unpack this. What is Ashforth arguing here? And lastly, what does Ashforth mean by spiritual insecurity? This is on page 374, but also in Medumo, pages 16 and 17. Can you define it in your own words, rather, and give some examples? So again, please bring responses to all three of these to next class so we can talk about them in person. Just a couple more very short, brief slides. We will be talking about witchcraft, as I've already mentioned, over the next couple of weeks in Africa, in the African context. But first, at least as we read Medumo, right, we're looking in Southern Africa and South Africa specifically. Witchcraft in Africa more generally shows the difficulty of establishing social relations based on trust. Ashforth writes on page 368, social life, therefore, must be premised on a presumption of malice, right? Because in societies where witchcraft is particularly prevalent, you'll find that there is a heightened social anxiety because you never know whether your neighbor, for example, could be a witch or could perpetrate witchcraft, right? So it's difficult to establish relationships of trust with folks. Okay. In many of these societies, jealousy is a very dangerous threat, by which I mean jealousy is more than something that's unfortunate or inconvenient. Jealousy, if enacted by a witch, can actually cause literal physical harm onto someone. And again, victims are often understood to be in an intimate relationship with a witch. The witch is not typically someone who has no relationship to the person. As we'll see in Medumo, the witch is someone that's often in an intimate relationship with the one who they perpetrate violence against. And witchcraft also shows the need to restore healthy social relations. So with accusations of witchcraft often come community level, local decisions to turn to healers to help resolve a witchcraft accusation. And what this does is it actually unites the community, right? It allows for them to talk through underlying social pressures, anxieties, tensions. Maybe there's a family fight, maybe there's a feud between two different landowning families in town and one involved witchcraft. So going to the healer, talking this through is one way of working through that which might have been left unspoken in society. Right? And as we will talk about, international rights groups are working to end witchcraft accusations, and this comes up in one of the questions that I've just asked you to think through for next class. So lastly, again, when we meet in person, we're going to go through those 3 questions, but I'd also like us to return to the first question I posed when I gave some context to Medumo, historical context, when we talked about apartheid. That is, to what extent does the political and economic context of post-apartheid South Africa play a role in Medumo? Okay, so thank you everyone very much for watching this virtual lecture, and I look forward to chatting with you next class. Once again, please be sure to bring your responses to those 3 questions then. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you soon.